Welcome to another thing about Tartan. This evening I am delighted to be joined by Kathi Kamleitner. Kathi is an Austrian travel blogger, but she's been here in Scotland since 2013. She was formerly an associate editor for an online travel magazine, which was written by and for women, and she then went on to write her own blog, Watch Me See, and more recently her podcast, Wild for Scotland. So with years of travel experience, a love for Scotland and wild adventure, I can't wait to hear more about Kathi's story. So welcome, Kathi.
Hello,
Hi. Hello there. So Kathi, you were born in Vienna, but then you went on to live in Denmark, Iceland and Germany before you moved to Scotland back in 2013. So have you always had a passion for travel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was something that was instilled to me by my parents. They, growing up in Austria during the 80s, before I was born even, they went down to Greece every summer and they drove all the way and spent 4 weeks every summer in Greece,
Wow.
traveling and enjoying the beach. And then I went for a couple of years as well until they kind of had to stop that. They've always traveled a lot with us, a lot within Austria. Every now and then we would go down to Greece and to the Mediterranean, which was brilliant. And that kind of sense of adventure, even if it was a bicycle trip in the weekends or a weekend trip somewhere closer to Vienna, that was very much part of my growing up and experiencing new places and finding those small adventures and big adventures anywhere we go. Yeah, that's always been part of my passion.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And so what was it in particular that drew you to Scotland then?
It was actually a bit of a thing that happened by chance. I wanted to study abroad for my master's degree and wanted to study somewhere in an English-speaking country, or at least where courses would be held in English. At the same time, in Austria, education is much, much cheaper than it is in the UK. And so it had to be somewhere where I could somehow afford university fees, which put my first kind of priority, which was Canada, really out of the picture. So I ended up in Scotland. I was always fascinated with Scotland. I had just never really visited before. I had this image in my head of green hills and very much what Scotland looks like, you know, mountains and the sea and animals and wildlife and lovely people and small towns. I had this in my head. I just never thought to actually visit. I don't know why. And then when I got accepted at Glasgow University, I was just over the moon and really, really looked forward to moving to Glasgow, even though I thought it would only be a year. And now it's 8 years later almost, and I'm still here.
Yeah. Oh, you must have liked it then.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, that's great. And so obviously we know that you've lived in a few different countries, but also that you can speak a number of languages. So I read German, Danish, a bit of Norwegian, and obviously English. So while you've been here in Scotland, have you ever picked up any Scots or Gaelic along the way?
So I have to admit, no. I am signed up for the Gaelic course on Duolingo, but I'm
Yeah.
not very. I just don't find the time. I need to make more time for it. I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by the Gaelic language. I
Mm.
learned Old Icelandic in school or in university in my undergrad, and
Okay.
that's where the Danish and Norwegian also kind of comes in. So Nordic words and the way they influence the Gaelic language and also the sounds and pronunciations of Gaelic words. I find it really fascinating, and it's actually something I've had to look a lot more into recently with the podcast, because I
Oh.
now not only have to write about these places, I have to actually pronounce them, and I didn't quite
Mm.
realize what I got myself into. I have a good
Yeah.
friend who luckily is a Gaelic speaker, and yeah, he's on my hotline. Whenever I need pronunciation help, I always ask him. But yeah, I wish I could speak more Gaelic, and I think it would be great to learn it actually. Even though, of course, there's not that many Gaelic speakers in Scotland, you get around with English. But it would be great to be able to speak it a little more and actually also understand some of the place names and what the words mean. Yeah, I'm very fascinated by it, but unfortunately, it's a difficult language to learn as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, when I was very small, I originally am from Fife, and I went to a nursery that was a Gaelic speaking nursery for
Hmm.
only for a small time, but I can't remember any of it, and that was so long ago. And it just seems like you say, a shame to not be able to understand some of this. So, likewise, I'm on Duolingo and I'm trying to up my knowledge, but as you pointed out, not an easy one. But I feel like there's a lot more interest in it in more recent years.
There is. I have a few friends whose kids are in the Gaelic schools here in Glasgow, and I know a few people who are also learning it and who are either Scottish and are learning it or who've moved here and more or less out of interest are learning it. It's one of those, if you don't, it's like with any language, if you don't use it every day, it's quite difficult to learn. But I think once you start getting better and you use it a bit more frequently, it will hopefully stick again.
And are there any like Scottish phrases or sayings that you've picked up along the way?
Slanjava.
There you go.
Oh,
I think if there had to be one, that's the one to learn, isn't
that's
it?
the one thing you should learn before you come here, definitely.
And Scotland's so full of traditions, and I think we're quite unique with all of our clan culture and whiskey, kilts, hundreds of tartans. So, when you first moved here, was there anything that you were just a bit baffled by, or were you ready to just embrace it, or anything you're just like, oh, what is this?
That makes me think of a few things. When you mentioned kilts there, I remembered the first ceilidh I ever attended, which was with Glasgow University. I was in the mountaineering club and they had an annual ceilidh. And I remember going to it. And of course, we have traditional, clothing in Austria as well. But I'm from Vienna, I'm from the city, so I've never really worn that. And it's very much a countryside thing, in my eyes anyways, in my home country. And then going to my first ceilidh and seeing all my friends, whether they were Scottish or English and studying up here or whatever, wherever they were from, all the men were dressed in kilts, and I was so enamored by it. I think they look amazing, and I loved how people just embrace traditional clothing to a very different level than they do back home, because it's not it doesn't matter where in Scotland you're from. Most people have a kilt or have at least worn a kilt at some point, most men. So that was something I found very fascinating and really loved seeing. I could have never imagined back home with my friends in the city, nobody would ever wear traditional clothing. So that was but I also thought about another thing, and that's something that still baffles me. And that is how there's just chips with everything. You have a chip sandwich, and you can have spaghetti with chips, and you can have anything carb-based with chips. There's always chips with everything. That's one of those things that really, I don't know how that works.
Okay, yeah, I suppose living here, I've never really thought of it, but I suppose we are big fans, and we've got lots of lovely Scottish potatoes, so
True.
yeah, we might as well make use of them, I guess. So, yeah. Oh, and so then obviously you've been here a long time now, like you say, and you had experience with travel. So then in 2016 you launched your own blog, Watch Me See. So can you tell us a bit more about the journey that led you to actually going out there and launching your very own blog?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started travel writing a few years before I moved to Scotland. And first I had kind of my own little blogs, and then I started writing for the magazine you mentioned earlier that is written by women for women and is all about travel. And over the years of living here, and initially I still traveled abroad quite a bit and could write about many different destinations, but the longer I was in Scotland, the more I started writing about Scotland.
Yeah.
To the point where my editor then said, Kathi, you really need to kind of write about other places too, and not only about Scotland. And I thought, well, I don't want to. So I kept writing for the magazine for a little while, but I also started Watch Me See as really my own kind of space where I get to decide what destinations and what regions I want to write about. And initially it was a lot of Scotland content. I wrote a few other places as well. I went to Canada and I went to the Faroe Islands, kind of Nordic or northern places as well, similar in the kind of experiences and activities maybe. But then after a while, I decided, okay, I'm going to only write about Scotland. That's where I travel most. That's what I love the most. That's what I want other people to kind of get a better idea of, what to do, what to see. and how to plan their trip. So that's kind of the journey. And then after finishing university here in Glasgow, I actually decided to go full time with it and turn it into a business, and not just do it as a hobby anymore, but really turn my life around and make it my business and my source of income to tell people about the fantastic things they can experience and do here in Scotland.
Oh, that's amazing. It's so good to hear that passion, you're able to, like you say, turn that into your living. So, oh, that's great. And then on the blog, you focus on four main different areas. So, practical travel advice, detailed destination guides, hiking and wild adventures, and delicious vegan food. So, if you had to choose one piece of advice for anyone traveling to Scotland, what would that be?
That's so difficult. I have
Yeah,
a blog post with 50 tips, so
I can imagine. Putting you on the spot here.
I think my biggest, or maybe my main mission with everything I do, with it, whether it's my blog or other parts of the business, is to inspire people to really think about what they want to experience and prioritize their own kind of what is important to them and what they are, what they want to get out of a trip to Scotland is, and really think about that before they plan their trip. I think a lot of people jump on the kind of typical tourist destinations and they go to visit the same places because that's the names they've heard before and that's what everybody's talking about. So in a way it's easier, or it seems like that's the best and the most beautiful places to visit. But that's not necessarily the case. And I think for everybody, there's a different aspect of Scotland that might interest them, or that might be the most suitable for them, or the best suitable travel style, whatever it is, right? Find the one thing that you definitely want to experience in Scotland, and then build your itinerary around that, so you make sure that you get that most important, that most unique experience for yourself in your trip.
Oh, well, that sounds great, and it can be applied not only to Scotland but anywhere you go. So,
True.
great advice.
Absolutely.
And obviously, you've written about so many different places. But again, if there was a region or a place or a trip you could repeat, and that was the only one you could ever do again, can you pick a favourite, or are there just too many?
Oh, that's difficult. You're putting me on the spot. I have favorite regions, even though of course it is a bit difficult to choose, because I think it doesn't really matter where you go in Scotland almost, because every region has something to offer, and a lot of the kind of essential experiences that you want to have in Scotland, whether it's to try the whiskey or learn about history or see castles, go on a hike and see the mountains. All of these things are possible in most regions anyways, they look slightly different from area to area. But if I had to choose a favorite, and I'm going to cheat a little because it's one of the bigger regions in Scotland, and one of my favorite places to visit is Argyll and the Isles. Both kind of Argyll on the mainland, whether it's kind of the Cowell Peninsula or the heart of Argyll around Loch Awe and Kilmartin Glen, which is so rich in history and historic sites. I love Oban. It's one of my favorite towns in Scotland, whether it's, staying in the town or using it as a home base to explore the islands. And then, of course, with Argyll, you have all the islands as well, which is why I'm saying I'm cheating a little bit. Those is special and unique in themselves. Colonsay and Cull are two of my favorite islands. I think if I could only visit Argyll and the islands for the rest of my life, I feel like there would be something new for years and years and years to come, because there's just so much to do and see. But yeah, everywhere is beautiful, and I don't want to make any other destinations feel left out. So
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good idea. Like you say, somewhere that's got lots of different landscapes and activities to offer. So I think that's a good choice. And I know for me that it was probably this year, for all that we couldn't travel internationally, actually in some ways it forced me to think about travelling more in Scotland. And I live right here in the southeast of Scotland, so yeah, getting to visit some of the islands that I hadn't previously was actually a great advantage of not being able to leave the country. So, yeah.
And on a sunny day, as long as you ignore the temperatures, you could almost feel like you're somewhere in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
On a good Scottish beach,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, use a little bit of imagination, and yeah, like you say, you're there. So,
Exactly.
yeah. Oh, and I've of course got to ask you if you have your own tartan or a favourite tartan. So I know for a lot of our international customers, they maybe aren't connected to a clan, but they'll pick a tartan relevant to a trip. So today I've got the Isle of Skye on here. So lovely greens and purples. There's like the really vibrant Edinburgh tartan.
Mm-hmm.
Any favourites you have?
Yeah, again, it's so hard to pick because there's just so many of them. I recently came across a tartan. I think it's a Stuart Modern. It's kind of very light, kind of a white background and then green and red kind of tartan stripes on it. And it's so vibrant and it's so beautiful. But so I recently got married, and even though I didn't take my Scottish partner's name, I am very much interested in the family Tartan, so in his clan Tartan, and that's Sutherland. So again, there's so many different varieties of it as well, but the kind of darker, very subtle tartan almost, that where sometimes you can't almost tell from far what tartan it is or what pattern it is directly, but the kind of dark green, dark blue, and mix of the two, I really enjoy that because it's a bit more subtle. I do like a good shouty, loud, bright red tartan as well, though. The characteristic one that you would think of, that I've seen when I was a kid. There was a phase where I was wearing red tartan skirts and things like that. So yeah, there's a little bit of everything in there. I think there's a lot of beautiful tartans, and yeah, I recently found out you could make your own tartan as well, and you could have a tartan design. So maybe one day there will be a watch me see tartan. Who knows?
Well, we'd be happy to help you create that. So, yeah. Well, woven textiles is what I studied at university. So yeah, any projects we have worked on, that's one of my favourite aspects of working here at Scotland Shop is getting to help people create their own, and also, like you say, helping them discover their clan history. And for you, obviously marrying into the Sutherlands, that must feel quite special to actually then be a member of that Scottish clan. So.
Yeah, I mean, they're not particularly, they don't celebrate, I would say, their clan history themselves, but it's quite interesting moving here without that connection myself. So many of my friends do have ancestry from Scotland, and they come here and they research that, and I've never really had that connection. So it's quite interesting to have that at least somehow annexed now.
Oh, that's great, and I think that's one of the best things about our clan culture is that you can, even if you're not directly linked, if you want to embrace it, you can become part of it, and through marriage, lots of people get to embrace it. So
Exactly.
that's great. And so, obviously, as part of your travels, then you get to do some great wild adventures, and that's what we're celebrating this month is Wild Scotland. So, you sent me some photos earlier today from some of your trips, and you definitely have an adventurous streak. So, are there any particular activities you enjoy then, or anything you weren't too sure about, but you're really glad you did give a try?
Yeah. So I fell in love with long distance hiking in Scotland. First doing part of the West Highland Way with some friends a few years ago, but then also starting doing it by myself. And one of the biggest adventures and greatest trips I've ever done was solo hiking the Hebridean Way, which is I think around 250 kilometers. I don't know the miles, I'm sorry. I think in kilometers. And it took me about 12 days, and I took a day break in the middle and a day of break at the end. So about 2 weeks in total. And you hike all the way from Battersea and Barra in the very south to Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis. And you come through all these different landscapes, the mountains and the moorlands. You walk along really beautiful sandy beaches and through all these small villages and towns. And there's something about doing that by yourself. I wild camped a lot and camped at campsites, met a lot of different people, hikers and cyclists. Waking up to views of the beach and the sea or the mountains by myself and having it all to myself, that was just absolutely just fantastic. I loved it so much. Even the days when the weather wasn't playing along, now I think back of those and I can laugh at how miserable some of the weather was.
I'm sure there was probably a few like that.
It's type 2 fun, they call it. You know, fun in the aftermath. But then an activity that I really enjoyed as well, and that I was a little bit scared of, but I'm so glad I did it, was the Via Ferrata in Loudon, which is a climb near Glencoe. There's a big waterfall there. I think it's the third tallest waterfall in Scotland. And an adventure company in that area, they have drilled iron steps into the rock leading up next to the waterfall. So you're always clipped in. You have a harness. You're clipped onto steel cables. You're always completely safe. But you do have to climb up these iron steps and the rocks as well. So it is quite physical. And once you're on it, there's no way back. You just have to go. And climb up alongside the waterfall at the top, and then there's steel cables running over the waterfall, so you cross right over the waterfall just on a steel cable. And then there's a short zip line at the end, and by the end I was done. My body was so tired, and you know, when you're a little scared, you tense up even more. But it was such an amazing experience, and it had been raining for a few days, so the water in the waterfall was just so powerful. It was absolutely brilliant. Such a great experience. You do need kind of at least half a day in the area to make time for it. Which is why I think for a lot of people, you know, they drive through that area, they might stop and go for a short walk, but they don't stay long enough. But yeah, that was one of my favorite experiences, I think, so far, because it's just, it's so thrilling, and it's a completely different way to experience a waterfall in Scotland as well.
Yeah, well, like I say, the photo looks incredible, so we'll make sure we bring it up on the screen here. But I don't know if I would have the nerve to do it, but I'm very impressed that you did.
It's great fun. It's good fun.
Okay, maybe I'll work up to it. Maybe there's like something I could do and then get to that.
Yeah, no, there's smaller climbs you can do, or even just starting to going to the climbing center and being comfortable in a harness. Once you know you can trust that, you'll be fine.
Yeah. Oh, sounds good. Well, I'll keep you posted if I make that. And so, as you mentioned, you often travel and hike solo and to overcome your fears. So, what would you say to anyone who's not so sure about that aspect of traveling alone to encourage them to do that?
Yeah, I get it. It's always a bit weird going away entirely on your own, especially when you've not done it in a while or you've not done it before. I think what I would say to people is that Scotland is one of the best places to go solo, if it's your first time solo traveling, particularly. On the one hand, because it's quite easy to get around, you know, public transport, the road systems are quite easy to understand. People are just super friendly. But there's also something about, you know, I already mentioned now, the people. There's something about the people you meet, both the locals and other travelers. You never really feel alone. Everybody's so open and welcoming. Whether you're not sure what to do on a specific day or you need help with something. I've been in some situations that were really not fun to be in on my solo trips, even around Scotland. You know, nothing dangerous or scary, but just uncomfortable situations where I just needed someone to help me out a bit. And I've never had to wait long until someone actually, you know, helped me. And that's something that I really appreciate about traveling solo in Scotland, is that, yes, you can be alone and you can get, you know, your alone time and get away from everybody. But if you need it, there's always someone there, and people are so friendly and welcoming. There's really nothing to be worried about too much, I would say.
Oh, sounds good. Well, hopefully we'll have inspired some people to go for it. So, yeah. And I would say during a trip, food and drink are always a big part of that trip. And traditionally here in Scotland, most meals tend to be quite meaty, but as you mentioned earlier, you've been vegan for a few years now, and that's something you write about. So have you been able to try many traditional Scottish dishes then?
So I wasn't vegan or vegetarian when I moved here. So initially I still ate meat and fish as well when I moved here. And then I went vegetarian, then I went vegan about 4 years ago, I would say. But what I find really fascinating is that Scotland, even though the kind of the typical cuisine is like you say, it's very big on meat, very big on seafood and cream and dairy and those kinds of things. It's so much easier to travel vegan here now than it was even 4 years ago, and it's getting easier and easier every year. Really, I experience more and more, adaptation and restaurants that have great menus. And there's a lot of vegan dishes you can actually make vegan quite easily. Whether that's kind of making fish and chips with tofu. I know it's not the same, but you still get the same kind of experience of eating a chippy. When it's wrapped in seaweed, it even tastes a bit like the sea. So that's something that a lot of people are doing now, and a lot of restaurants are offering. Vegan haggis is, of course, a thing. Vegetarian haggis has been around for many decades, and that's vegan. And I would argue for many people that's probably more appealing than the real thing.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the, like you say, the vegetarian haggis. And I've been vegetarian myself for probably like, I don't even know, about 14 years now. So yeah, for me, I have tried traditional haggis, but I've kind of grown up with vegetarian haggis. And like you say, a lot of people really enjoy it. And I was really lucky back in January to interview James McSween. So for anyone who doesn't know, probably one of the best known haggis manufacturers here in Scotland, and it was actually James's dad who created the first vegetarian haggis for the opening of the Scottish Poetry Library. So that was a great story to hear about how that all came about and all the kind of testing that they did to get that kind of the oil right. He always said it was the fat within it was the what took them a while to perfect. But yeah, I'm so glad that they did.
Me too. And I think there's something around Scottish chefs. They really seem to love the challenge, almost to create vegan dishes and to create Scottish dishes in a vegan way. There's a great cookbook called Scottish Vegan Cookbook or Vegan Scottish Cookbook, one of the two. And that has all the typical Scottish recipes you can imagine, but veganized and vegan versions of it. Bannochen and Cullen skink without the fish, and yeah, you can make pretty much anything vegan if you want to. And of course, whiskey is vegan, so we're all safe.
Yeah, I know that you're a whiskey fan, so.
Yes, now I am.
Okay, yeah, it's a bit of a desire
Years ago.
yeah, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but I think once you're into it, then yeah.
It took probably about 6 years for me.
Okay, I think, I'm getting there, but like you, I think I'll keep at it. And we've been speaking to lots of amazing other guests. So I spoke to Alan Heron, who is originally Scottish but now runs a bar out in New York. So he's a great person because he was telling me kind of good whiskies to get into if you weren't too sure about what you liked and how to figure out what you did like. And so that was really helpful. So yeah.
Once you have an appreciation for the craft and the art of making whiskey, then it's really just about finding the right one. If you're not interested by the whole thing, then maybe not. But yeah. I was always fascinated by it. I always really appreciated the artistry of it. I just didn't like it, but now I do.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear you've been won over. So. And so then last year, in addition to your blog, you launched the podcast Wild for Scotland. So you described that as an immersive storytelling podcast. So had you always wanted to launch the podcast, or was that kind of born due to lockdown and not being able to get out and explore? Or?
It was very much born out of lockdown. I had always enjoyed telling stories, of course. And I've always enjoyed writing stories and kind of communicating with my readers and telling them about what they can do and what they can experience here. But in the last 12 months, of course, there was less of that in my life. And so during lockdown, I kind of, especially during the second long lockdown in the UK, in Scotland, I thought about ways that I can still communicate my passion for Scotland and my kind of what I do and what I want other people to think about when they plan their own trips. But not tie it so much to whether someone is already researching a trip or not, because most people find my website because they're planning a trip to Scotland and they're Googling, they're going on Google, they look for inspiration and for tips and for travel guides.
Yeah.
And I wanted to create something that people could find and people could find interesting, even with, regardless of whether they have a trip coming up or not. I wanted people to feel connected to Scotland, no matter where they are, whether they're in Scotland and kind of stuck in their local area, or around the world, whether they're in Australia or New Zealand or Canada. And I want everybody to feel connected with Scotland through these stories. And my idea with the podcast was very much like, if you were to sit down in your couch and maybe you close your eyes, or even just, you relax a little and you put on the podcast and you listen to the story and the way I just try to describe everything that is around me, what you see, what you smell, what you hear, and make it as immersive as possible. Can you imagine that you're there with me in that moment? And from what I gather, a lot of people do feel like that, and that makes me really proud and makes me very happy that I'm able to produce something that people can kind of escape their life a little bit, or their current situation for a little bit, and just dream away and find themselves in Scotland, even if it's only in their head for now.
Oh, well, that's great. And so do you ever have guests on the podcast, or is it all you telling stories then?
At the moment, it's just myself. So I've just finished up season 1, and which was all about Scottish islands. So there's 10 episodes, and each episode goes to a different island, or in some episodes, there's a couple of islands in there. And so it's all just myself, travel stories, and then followed with a few tips for that particular island or that region that we're going to in the story. I'm already working on season 2, which will probably be quite similar, which has a lot to do with just still travel restrictions and things like that. But I'm hoping that in the future, I will be able to combine stories with interviews, maybe with locals who live in the area that the story visits, or having experts on who can tell us about like certain activities or, certain topics about Scotland that I don't know enough about to just go on about myself. So yeah, maybe in the future there will be guests on it as well. But for now, it's just me telling stories. And yeah, I hope that people find it like, story time for adults.
Oh, that sounds great. And yeah, like you say, that sounds like a great plan for the future to speak to the locals too. So.
Yeah. Once I can travel around and I can actually meet them where they are, a bit more freely. I know we can now, but it's still a bit difficult to get people and not being able to go inside and with face masks on and all of that. Hopefully in the future it will be a bit easier to record with one another in an actual space where they live and work.
Oh, sounds great. And so as we start to come out of lockdown here, is there anywhere that you're desperate to get back to?
So I'm actually just back from my first post-lockdown trip, which was amazing. I went to Haggis, both to the coast and the Haggis Glens, and then I kind of cut across the country and went to Ardnamurchan and the West Highland Peninsulas. So I just did a week of that, and it was so good. It was so nice to be out in the country. I've got a trip coming up in June, going to Glencoe, which is one of my favorite areas in Scotland, and I'm going to go for a hike in that area as well, at least for a weekend, and get a couple of hikes in. So I look forward to that. And then if there's a place I would love to go back to, from all the places I've been to before, it's the Outer Hebrides and it's island hopping, and maybe this time not just by, on foot, but actually with a car, so I can see even more of the islands and have an even bigger reach and explore and experience more of the Outer Hebrides.
Sounds great. Very jealous of your recent trip. So yeah, we'll all be out there soon enough. So
Exactly.
for a lot of our international travellers, obviously unfortunately at the moment they may not be able to be here in person, but I'm sure a lot of you are busy planning away for the future. So Kathi, that's something you also do in addition to the blog is you offer the service to help people plan those trips and review their itineraries. So can you tell us a bit about that process and how that all works?
Yeah. So that kind of came about again by just many of my readers asking for advice. They've seen my itineraries on the blog, but wanted to slightly adapt them, make them longer, make them shorter. So I started offering both itinerary reviews as well as itinerary planning. So I can either review someone's itinerary if they've done kind of 80-90% of their own itinerary, help them fill gaps, figure out logistics, or even adapt and amend how long to stay in which place and where they might want to spend a bit more time and a bit less time. And then the other option is that I create a bespoke itinerary for clients where they tell me what they want to see, and I will do my very best to get everything into one itinerary, whether it's a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I've done all sorts of trips, solo travelers, couples coming on anniversary trips. Most recently, in last winter, I was part of creating an itinerary for a surprise trip that a husband gave his wife for Christmas. That was very special. That was super nice to be part of that. So yeah, I've created all sorts of itineraries for all sorts of people. But yeah, it's nice, I think, to have that local on the ground who knows how long it takes to drive from one place to another, what there is to do, what's kind of maybe a bit under discovered and what's maybe a bit overrated, although there's a few places in Scotland that are overrated, I think.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and so for anyone that wants to find out more, you've written a guest post for us as well. So yeah,
Exactly.
all of the details are in there. And I know one of the stories you mentioned was someone that was trying to discover more about their clan history, so you helped them with that as well.
Yeah, so I'm not a historian. It's not my speciality to know about all clans of Scotland. But I do love when someone comes to me and they want to experience some of the country, but also explore their clan history. I love exploring and combining the two, because what I found is that very often following your clan history will take you to places that might not always be the most touristy or the best known places, but get you a little bit off the beaten track. And yeah, I had a client 2 years ago, I think, and he was a McLachlan, and he wanted to kind of follow the footsteps of his ancestors on the Cowal Peninsula. And even though I had been to the Cowal Peninsula before, I didn't know it that in depth. So it was really fun actually researching some of the places that he and his wife could go and visit to see where his ancestors, were from and came from. And I actually managed to go to one of the castles that he wanted to visit as well last summer, Old Castle Latham. It's in ruins, and there's a newer castle next to it almost, that's still lived in by the owners, but the ruins you can go and explore. And that was one of those things I would have never really found out about unless it wasn't for that client. And if he hadn't had that clan connection, he would have never thought about going to that area either. So it's a series of really fortunate accidents, so to say, that bring out those hidden gems. And it's now definitely something that I would recommend to people, whether they have clan history or not, because the Cowal Peninsula is just stunning.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Kathi, and sharing your travel insights and all your stories. And I hope you have a safe next few months, and can't wait to see you get back out there and read all about your future adventures. So, for anyone that wants to follow you, they need to head to watchmesee.com, and all of your social media accounts are at watchmesee. And if they want to listen to the podcast, well, for Scotland, then that's available everywhere you can listen to podcasts.
Exactly.
Well, like I say, thank you so much. And as I mentioned, there's also the guest post. So if you want to find out more about Kathi and her tips, then you can head there too.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you.
Have a lovely day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.